A wealthy CEO barged into his downtown office on a cold Oregon morning, his temper as sharp as the winter air. His young brunette secretary had made a small mistake on a report, but to him it was unforgivable. He shouted across the room, belittling her in front of everyone before slamming his hand on the desk. The whole office fell silent, afraid to move or speak. He thought no one would stand up to him, but just outside, a Navy SEAL and his K-9 had stopped by for a meeting, and they had seen everything. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, remember to subscribe for more powerful tales of courage, loyalty, and hope. The morning chill lingered over Ashland, Oregon, a quiet town where the mist rolled down from the mountains and settled between rows of office buildings still waking up to the day. Inside one of them, a modest two-story structure with glass doors that caught the weak winter sunlight, Daniel Harlow, the 45-year-old CEO with slicked-back salt and pepper hair, and a custom suit, was already in motion, his voice sharp enough to slice through the low hum of computers. "Do you even know how to spell initiative, Clara?" he snapped, slamming a folder onto the desk. Clara Benson, the 20-year-old brunette secretary with soft brown eyes and a quiet demeanor, flinched but didn't respond. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, trying to steady themselves. "I asked you to have this report ready by 9, Daniel continued, pacing behind her chair. "It's 9:05. Do you think 5 minutes late is acceptable when I'm trying to run a company?" Clara swallowed hard, staring at the document she'd just finished formatting. "It's done," she said softly, sliding the printed report toward him. "I just wanted to double-check the—" "Don't talk back to me," he barked, his hand striking the desk beside her, the sound sharp enough to draw glances from two nearby co-workers. They looked up, then quickly down again, pretending not to hear. Daniel leaned in, lowering his voice. "You think being young and pretty means you can get away with mistakes? Let me tell you something. You're here because I took pity on you. Don't test me." Clara's face burned as she nodded mutely. He smirked faintly, pleased by her silence. Outside the office, across the street, a dark green pickup sat parked by the curb. Inside was Evan Pierce, the 37-year-old Navy SEAL with short brown hair, sipping black coffee as he watched the building's reflection in his windshield. In the passenger seat sat Ranger, the large black and tan German Shepherd K-9 with sharp amber eyes that never seemed to blink. They had just returned from a morning training session with the local police department, Evan S.'s latest volunteer project since retiring from active service, and were waiting for their contact inside the building to bring out paperwork. Instead, through the open blinds on the second floor, Evan saw the argument unfolding. His sharp eyes caught the tense movements, the way the man's hand came down too close to the woman's arm, the way her body stiffened in fear. Ranger let out a low growl from the passenger seat. Evan's gaze hardened. "Yeah, I see it too," he muttered, setting his coffee down. Back inside, Daniel's temper was only getting worse. "You don't belong in this office," he sneered, pacing behind Clara. "Maybe you should be serving coffee instead of spilling it on my documents." Clara's lips parted in protest, but she stopped herself. Her mother had told her not to argue with men like this. "Just get through the day," she'd said. "Get the paycheck. It'll get better." But it wasn't getting better. It was getting worse. Daniel's shadow loomed over her as he stepped closer, placing his hand on her shoulder, fingers digging in just enough to make her flinch. "You understand me, don't you?" he said, voice low and poisonous. "You're here to do what I ask, without attitude." Clara pushed his hand off, trembling but firm. "Don't touch me." The room went still. Daniel blinked, taken aback by her defiance, then his expression twisted into something cold. "You're lucky anyone even hired you," he hissed, and with a sudden burst of anger he struck her across the face. The sound echoed off the office walls. Papers fluttered to the floor. For a moment, no one moved. Then Clara stumbled sideways, her chair crashing over. One co-worker gasped quietly. Another stood frozen near the copier, afraid to interfere. Daniel stood over her, his breathing heavy, eyes glassy with self-righteous fury. "You think you can talk to me like that?" he spat. "You're nothing here." He turned to see the blinds shift. Across the street, through the glass, someone was watching. Evan Pierce was already out of the truck, the door slamming shut with precision. Ranger followed, tail low, muscles coiled. They crossed the street without hurry, but with unmistakable purpose, boots hitting pavement in steady rhythm. Inside the office, Daniel straightened his jacket, his arrogance returning. "Get up," he ordered Clara. "Clean yourself up before anyone sees you crying." She didn't move. Daniel turned, annoyance flashing across his face. "Who are you?" he demanded. Evan's eyes flicked to Clara, then back to him. "Doesn't matter. I saw what you just did." Daniel laughed bitterly. "What, you think you can just walk in here and—" "You hit her," Evan said, voice low and even, like a quiet wave before the break. "That's not a mistake. That's a choice." Daniel scoffed. "Oh, please, don't give me the hero act. You don't know who I am." "I know exactly who you are," Evan replied. "You're the kind of man who only feels strong when everyone else is afraid." Ranger took one step forward, his gaze locked on Daniel. The air in the office shifted, sharp, electric still. Daniel's bravado faltered. "You can't threaten me," he said, though his voice had lost its edge. "That dog better be trained." Evan tilted his head slightly. "He's more disciplined than you'll ever be." Clara finally rose from the floor, clutching her cheek. Daniel's eyes flicked to her, then back to Evan. "You don't belong here," he said. "Neither does she." "You're right," Evan said quietly. "You don't deserve people like her in your life, or your company." He turned to Clara. "You good?" She nodded shakily. "You should leave," Evan told her. "I'll take care of the rest." Daniel took a step forward, rage boiling again. "You think you can walk in here and tell me how to run my business?" "No," Evan said, stepping closer until they stood inches apart. "But I can make sure you never forget the day you learned what real respect looks like." For a long moment, no one spoke. Ranger growled low, a warning that rumbled through the floor. Daniel's mouth opened, but whatever words he had died there. He backed up slowly, the fight draining out of him. Evan turned slightly, nodding toward Clara. "Go on," he said softly. She hesitated, then walked out through the door, brushing past Ranger, whose ears stayed pricked but calm. "You okay?" he asked again. Clara nodded, voice trembling. "Thank you?" "Don't thank me," he said. "Thank the fact that some people still know right from wrong." Ranger pressed his head gently against her hand, as if reassuring her that it was over. And for the first time that morning, it truly was. The day after the confrontation, Ashland's gray skies hung low, and the air carried that restless chill that hinted at snow. Clara Benson, the 20-year-old brunette secretary, walked through the downtown square with her coat pulled tight, her thoughts a blur. She hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel Harlow, the 45-year-old CEO, leaning over her desk, his voice sharp and cold. But alongside that memory came another, the image of Evan Pierce, the 37-year-old Navy SEAL, standing in the doorway like something solid and unmoving in a world that suddenly felt like it might collapse. His calm voice had cut through the noise, his presence alone enough to make the chaos stop. Clara reached the corner cafe, the one she often passed on her way home but never went into, and stepped inside. The warmth and smell of roasted coffee beans washed over her, grounding her. She found a seat by the window and stared out at the frost-covered cars lining the street. Somewhere out there, she thought, was a man who had no reason to help her, and yet did. Across town, Evan stood in front of the county sheriff's office, holding Ranger's leash as the German shepherd sat alert beside him. The sheriff, a 50-year-old man named Tom Dwyer, adjusted his hat as he listened to Evan's quiet words. "You're telling me the CEO of Harlow & Co. assaulted one of his employees in broad daylight?" "That's what I saw," Evan replied. Dwyer sighed. "That tracks. Harlow's got money, connections. I'll file it, but without witnesses, it won't go far." "You have my statement," Evan said simply. Dwyer studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You're a good man, Pierce. Just keep your distance. Guys like Harlow don't take embarrassment well." Evan gave a short nod, his gaze steady. "That's what worries me." Later that afternoon, Clara sat at her desk in the nearly empty office. Most of the staff avoided looking her way. Daniel hadn't shown up all morning, and when he finally walked in, his expression was calm, too calm. "Morning, everyone," he said, smiling thinly. "Let's have a productive day." Clara kept her gaze on the computer screen, her heart thudding softly in her chest. She could feel his eyes on her as he passed by. "Miss Benson," he said lightly, "a word in my office." She followed him in, keeping her distance. He closed the door behind them. "You've caused me quite the headache," he said. "Do you know how bad it looks when people think I mistreat my staff?" "I didn't say anything," Clara said quietly. "You don't need to," he replied. "The town's already talking. They saw that soldier. Now they think I'm the villain." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You don't want to make enemies in a place like this. You won't find another job." Clara straightened. "You can't threaten me?" He smiled faintly. "It's not a threat. It's reality." What Daniel didn't know was that Evan had stopped by the office again that day, waiting in the lobby for a friend upstairs. He wasn't looking for trouble, but something in his gut told him this wasn't over. Ranger sat beside him, silent and watchful. Through the frosted glass doors, Evan saw Daniel's tall frame and Clara's smaller one beside him, her shoulders tense. He didn't move right away, just watched, reading the moment. Then Daniel's hand slammed the desk. Evan stood. Inside the office, Daniel's voice was sharp. "You think that soldier will protect you forever? Guys like him move on." Clara met his eyes. "He doesn't need to stay. He just did what was right." Daniel's expression hardened, but before he could respond, the office door opened. Evan's voice was calm. "That's enough." Daniel turned. "You again? You have no business here." Evan's tone stayed even. "Maybe. But I don't like seeing people cornered." Daniel laughed bitterly. "You think you can intimidate me with that dog?" Evan nodded toward Ranger, who stood silently behind him. "He's not here to intimidate," he said. "He's here to remind you what discipline looks like." Daniel glared. "You can't keep barging in here." "I won't have to," Evan said evenly, "because this is your last warning." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Daniel scoffed, grabbing his phone. "You're finished here, Clara. Pack your things." "No," Evan said quietly. "She's not." Daniel froze. "You don't get to decide that." "I'm not deciding anything," Evan said, "but the sheriff has my statement. Try anything else and you'll have more to explain than your pride." Daniel's confidence faltered. Evan turned to Clara. "You don't have to stay here." She looked at him, then at Daniel, and shook her head. "I'm done." She walked out. Evan followed, Ranger close behind. Outside, the cold air hit them, sharp and clear. Clara stood on the steps, her breath fogging in the chill. "I don't know what happens now," she said. "You start over," Evan replied simply. She nodded, glancing down at Ranger, who pressed gently against her leg. For the first time in a long while, she smiled. Evan opened his truck door, and Ranger climbed in first. As they pulled away, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall over Ashland, soft, quiet, and cleansing. Snow had begun to fall across Ashland by the next morning, soft flakes drifting over the quiet town and covering the streets in a thin layer of white. The cold air carried that stillness only winter mornings could hold, the kind that made sound feel distant and time seem slower. Inside a small diner on Main Street, the scent of coffee and maple syrup filled the air. Evan Pierce, the 37-year-old Navy SEAL, sat at a corner booth with Ranger, his German Shepherd, resting patiently beside him. The dog's steady gaze followed every movement outside the frosted window, alert but calm. Evan sipped his coffee, eyes scanning the street without urgency, but with a soldier's instinctive awareness. He had promised himself he was only passing through, that Ashland wasn't his fight. But some promises were meant to be broken. At the same time, Clara Benson, the 20-year-old brunette secretary, walked down the same street wrapped in a gray coat and wool scarf. She carried a folder under one arm, her resignation papers. Even after what had happened, she wanted to leave properly. It was her nature to finish things cleanly, even when the world hadn't been kind. As she neared the office, she hesitated at the sight of Daniel Harlow's black luxury sedan parked in its usual spot. The man inside was a reminder of everything she wanted to leave behind, yet she pushed forward, straightening her shoulders as she stepped inside. The office was quieter than usual. Most employees kept to their desks, speaking in low voices that died away when Clara entered. The atmosphere was heavy with the unspoken knowledge of what had happened. Daniel's door stood open, and his voice carried through the hall, firm but restrained. He was on the phone, talking about contracts, numbers, deadlines, the kind of talk that gave him power. When he saw Clara waiting at the doorway, he paused mid-sentence. His expression shifted quickly from irritation to a forced smile. "Well, look who decided to show up," he said, setting the phone down. "Come in." Clara stepped inside and placed the folder neatly on his desk. "My resignation," she said. Daniel's brows lifted slightly. "Is that so? I didn't think you'd have the courage to walk away." "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she said quietly. He leaned back in his chair, amused. "You really think walking out makes you brave? You'll regret this, Clara. No one in this town hires without checking with me." She looked at him steadily. "Then I'll go somewhere you don't exist." For a long moment, Daniel just stared at her. The air between them seemed to hum with the tension of two opposing worlds, one built on fear, the other on finally breaking free from it. He reached for the folder but didn't open it. "You know, I could make this easy for you," he said. "Withdraw this, and I'll forget your little outburst. I might even give you a raise." Clara shook her head. "No amount of money would make me stay." His smile faded, replaced by something darker. "You think that soldier can protect you forever?" he muttered. "He'll leave, and you'll still be nothing." Clara's voice trembled, but her words didn't. "I'd rather be nothing than live in fear of you." With that, she turned and walked out before he could say another word. The door closed behind her with a soft click, final and unshakable. For the first time in years, Daniel found himself speechless. Across the street, Evan looked up from his coffee as Clara stepped into the diner, her face pale from the cold but steady with purpose. Ranger perked up immediately, tail brushing the floor. Evan gave a small nod of greeting. "You did it," he said simply. "Yeah," she breathed, sliding into the seat across from him. "I did." "How'd it feel?" "Like breathing again," she said, a faint smile crossing her lips. Evan studied her for a moment. "Good. That's what freedom feels like." The waitress brought fresh coffee, and the two sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the sidewalks in soft white. Clara glanced out the window, her voice quiet. "Do you ever stop helping people, Evan?" He gave a small shrug. "Habit. Some things stick with you." She smiled faintly. "And Ranger, does he get tired of it?" "He likes having a purpose," Evan said, glancing down at the dog. Ranger gave a soft huff, almost as if in agreement. But even as they sat there, Evan's instincts whispered that the calm wouldn't last. He had seen men like Daniel before, the kind who mistook fear for respect, who couldn't stand losing control. He didn't know when the next move would come, only that it would, and when it did, he would be ready. As the day turned to evening, the snowfall grew heavier. Daniel sat alone in his office, staring at the closed door Clara had walked through hours earlier. The silence around him felt heavier than usual. He poured himself a drink, but the taste did nothing to ease the tightness in his chest. Outside, the city lights blurred against the snow, and in their reflection, he thought he saw something, the faint outline of a man standing by a truck across the street. When he blinked, it was gone. He leaned back, unsettled, though he didn't understand why. Evan, meanwhile, stood outside his truck, watching the office windows through the falling snow. He wasn't there to intimidate. He was there to make sure nothing else happened. Ranger stood beside him, still and alert. The streets were nearly empty now, the sound of passing cars muffled by the weather. Evan knew Daniel wouldn't change overnight, but he also knew fear had a way of teaching men the lessons pride refused to learn. Clara, back at her small apartment, sat on the couch with a cup of tea, the folder from earlier resting on the table. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to breathe without expectation or worry. The snow outside glowed softly under the streetlights, and she realized how peaceful silence could be when it wasn't filled with dread. She didn't know where she'd go next, but she knew one thing. She would never let anyone like Daniel Harlow define her again. Out on the street, Evan and Ranger finally turned away, walking down the quiet road as the snow continued to fall. Their silhouettes faded into the distance, a man and his dog, always moving forward, ready for whatever waited beyond the next town, leaving behind a place just a little bit safer than they found it. Evening settled over Ashland with a quiet weight, the kind that made the whole town feel smaller. The lights from the shops flickered in the snow, and the faint hum of cars passing along the main road filled the silence between gusts of wind. Inside his office, Daniel Harlow, the 45-year-old CEO, sat behind his desk staring at the darkened window. His reflection stared back, composed, well-dressed, every bit the man of power he pretended to be. But something in the glass didn't look the same anymore. The moment with Clara kept replaying in his mind. The look on her face when she stood up to him had cut deeper than he cared to admit. He prided himself on control, on being the one who made others flinch first. But she hadn't flinched, not this time. And that soldier, that stranger, had seen it all. Across town, the same stormy unease had followed Evan Pierce back to his cabin on the outskirts of Ashland. The snow had thickened now, and the quiet stretch of land around his home felt more like a buffer between him and the noise of the world. Ranger, his German shepherd, lay near the wood stove, watching him with those steady, amber eyes. Evan leaned against the counter, staring at the fire. He told himself it was over. Clara was safe, Daniel had been warned, but his instincts disagreed. There was a kind of silence that didn't mean peace, only pause. And this felt like one of those silences. The next morning, the snow had stopped, but the cold had deepened. Clara Benson walked through the small farmer's market near the center of town, holding a thermos of coffee in her gloved hands. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke, and for a moment she almost felt normal again. People greeted her kindly, though she noticed some curious glances. Small towns had a way of spreading stories faster than truth. Still, she smiled and kept walking. She had made her choice to leave the office, and even though she didn't know what came next, she felt lighter. At the same time, Daniel was already at work rebuilding his image. He called in his assistant, a middle-aged man named Brian who had worked for him for years. "We're doing damage control," Daniel said briskly. "If anyone asks, Miss Benson left for personal reasons. Make sure that's the only version of the story out there." Brian hesitated, his voice cautious. "People saw what happened, sir." Daniel's expression hardened. "Then make sure they forget it." He turned toward the window, adjusting his tie. "No one humiliates me in my own office." That evening, Evan found himself back in town again, sitting at the diner where he and Clara had talked days earlier. He hadn't planned to return, but routine had a way of guiding him toward the places that needed watching. Ranger rested by his feet, calm but alert. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, poured him another cup of coffee. "Back again?" she asked with a smile. "Guess I like the view," he said lightly. But his eyes weren't on the snow outside. They were on the office building across the street, where a single light still burned on the second floor. He knew Daniel was there. Men like him never knew when to stop working, or scheming. Clara walked home through the snow that night, the streetlights casting soft halos around her as she passed. Her breath fogged in front of her, and the crunch of her boots was the only sound. She had just reached the corner when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, heart jumping, but it was only a neighbor heading home. She exhaled slowly, embarrassed by her own nerves, yet the unease lingered. She glanced down the street and thought, for a split second, she saw a dark car idling near the corner before it drove away. She told herself it was nothing, but she walked faster anyway. The next morning, Evan visited Sheriff Dwyer again. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, studying him over the rim of his coffee mug. "You're not planning to stick around, are you?" he asked. "Wasn't planning to," Evan said. "But that CEO, Harlow, he's the kind of man who holds grudges." Dwyer nodded slowly. "That he is. I got a few complaints already. Word is he's been calling people in town, trying to discredit the girl. You think he'll go further than that?" Evan met his eyes. "If his pride's hurt bad enough, yeah, he will." The sheriff sighed. "I'll keep an eye on him. But don't go looking for a fight, Pierce." Evan gave a faint smile. "I never have to look far." By mid-afternoon, Daniel sat in his office again, scrolling through his phone. His expression tightened when he saw an article headline from a local blog. "Prominent CEO accused of harassment by former employee." There were no names mentioned, but everyone would know who it meant. He slammed the phone down and stood abruptly. The anger that simmered beneath his polished demeanor finally cracked through. He put on his black coat, his movements sharp and deliberate. If no one else would fix this, he would. The streets were slick with melting snow when Daniel Asa's car pulled out of the parking lot and disappeared into the gray. Evan and Ranger were back in the truck by then, heading toward the outskirts of town. The radio murmured softly, but Evan wasn't listening. Ranger lifted his head, ears twitching, eyes fixed on the road behind them. Evan glanced in the rearview mirror and noticed a familiar car following several lengths back. Dark, polished, too familiar to mistake. His grip on the wheel tightened. "Guess the storm's not over yet," he muttered. Meanwhile, Clara spent the rest of her day at the town library, sending out applications and trying to ignore the weight of uncertainty that pressed at the back of her mind. She had never been the kind of person to rely on others, but she found herself hoping she might see Evan again. There was something about the quiet steadiness of him and the way Ranger seemed to mirror that calm that made her feel safe. When she left the library at dusk, snowflakes were falling again, swirling in the lamplight like tiny stars. For the first time in a long while, she smiled without forcing it. Across town, though, Daniel Harlow wasn't smiling. He was driving through the back roads of Ashland, the same route he knew Clara took home every evening. The snow fell heavier now, softening the world into shades of white and gray. He told himself he only wanted to talk, to clear the air, but the tightness in his jaw said otherwise. Pride and anger blurred together, driving him faster through the cold night. And somewhere just behind, unseen but close, a dark green pickup with a single headlight out followed at a careful distance, its driver and loyal companion, ready for whatever came next. The snowstorm continued into the following morning, covering Ashland in a blanket of white so thick it muffled every sound. For most of the town, it meant quiet routines and slow starts. But for Evan Pierce, the 37-year-old Navy SEAL, it meant observation. He sat on the porch of his cabin overlooking the valley, a cup of black coffee in hand, watching the faint trail of tire tracks leading down the road. Ranger, his German shepherd, sat beside him, alert despite the stillness. They had followed Daniel Harlow's car the night before, far enough to confirm what Evan had already suspected. The man wasn't ready to let things go. The kind of pride that lived in Daniel wasn't content with losing control. It needed to prove something, and that made him dangerous. In town, Clara Benson, the 20-year-old brunette secretary, walked through the grocery store, filling a small basket with essentials. She had decided to stay busy, to take her life back in small, ordinary ways. People smiled politely when they saw her, but she could feel the weight of curiosity behind their glances. The story had spread faster than she hoped. Some had heard she quit. Others whispered that she'd been fired. A few even said she was suing Daniel Harlow, though she hadn't. The gossip didn't matter. What mattered was that she was standing in that aisle, living her own life again, one small choice at a time. Daniel, meanwhile, sat in his office pretending to work. The snow outside was thick, swirling against the window panes, but his mind wasn't on the paperwork in front of him. He replayed the conversation with Clara, the look in her eyes when she walked out for good. Somewhere beneath his anger, a flicker of unease had taken root. It wasn't guilt. He had long stopped recognizing that feeling, but something more uncomfortable. Awareness. People had seen what happened. The town wasn't treating him the same. The respect he had demanded was cracking. He tapped a pen against the desk, eyes narrowing. Someone was behind it, and he already knew who. That afternoon, Evan stopped by Sheriff Dwyer's office again. The sheriff was hunched over a stack of reports, but he looked up with a faint smile when he saw the soldier and his dog at the door. "Pierce," he greeted. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." "I'm good," Evan replied, leaning against the wall. "Any news about Harlow?" Dwyer shook his head. "Nothing official. But he's been calling people around town, trying to control the story. Can't say I'm surprised." Evan nodded slightly. "He won't stop there? He's not the kind of man who accepts quiet endings." The sheriff sighed. "You planning to stay close?" "For a while," Evan said. Ranger glanced toward the window, ears twitching. "I figured as much," Dwyer muttered. "Just don't go making my paperwork harder than it already is." Evan smirked faintly. "No promises." That evening, the storm eased enough for the town to breathe again. Clara sat in her apartment, the soft glow of a lamp warming the quiet room. She was sorting through old papers, shredding what she didn't need, building a new sense of order. Her phone buzzed once on the table. When she saw the number, she hesitated, unknown but local. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Hello?" Silence at first, then a voice she recognized. "Clara." It was Daniel. Her stomach tightened. "What do you want?" she asked. "Just to talk," he said, his tone controlled. "You left things in a bad place. I think we can clear the air." "There's nothing to clear," she said firmly. "Don't call me again." "You don't want to make this harder than it has to be," he replied. "People are saying things that could ruin both of us. Let me help you fix it." "Goodbye, Daniel." She hung up, her hands trembling slightly, but her resolve firm. The moment she set the phone down, there was a soft growl at the edge of her thoughts, memory of another growl, steady and protective. Ranger. And the quiet strength in Evan's voice. She exhaled slowly, grounding herself again. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. She didn't notice the car that drove past her apartment complex twice before parking across the street. Evan started walking, slow and deliberate. The streetlights cast long shadows across the snow, and the crunch of his boots was the only sound. Ranger moved beside him, steps silent, ears alert. The car's headlights flicked off just as they approached. Evan stopped a few yards away, his breath misting in the cold air. "Evening, Harlow," he said quietly. The driver's door opened, and Daniel stepped out, his black coat blending into the dark. His voice was tight with irritation. "You following me now?" "Just out for a walk," Evan replied. "You have a habit of showing up where you shouldn't." "I'm not breaking any laws," Daniel said quickly. "You sure about that?" Evan asked. Ranger's growl was soft but unmistakable. Daniel glanced at the dog, then back at Evan. "You think you can scare me with that mutt?" he said, trying to sound amused. Evan didn't flinch. "He doesn't scare people. He protects them." For a moment, the air between them froze, both men measuring the other. Then Daniel gave a small laugh, forced and bitter. "You really think you can save her? You don't even know her." Evan's expression didn't change. I don't have to. I just don't like bullies. Daniel's smirk faltered, replaced by something colder. He stepped forward, lowering his voice. You think you can stand between me and what's mine? Evan didn't move. She doesn't belong to you, he said evenly. You don't own people. Ranger let out another low rumble, deep and steady. Daniel hesitated, then turned back toward his car. You're making a mistake, he said over his shoulder. Evan's voice was calm, final. The only mistake would be if you showed up here again. Daniel got into the car, slammed the door, and drove off into the snow. Evan watched until the taillights disappeared down the road. Ranger stood perfectly still beside him, breath visible in the cold. Evan gave a slow nod. Good work, he said softly. The dog's ears twitched, eyes scanning the street. Evan looked up at the apartment windows where a light still glowed faintly. He didn't need to see Clara to know she was safe, for now. But he also knew that this wasn't finished. Men like Daniel didn't stop after being told once. They stopped when they had nothing left to control. And until that day came, he and Ranger would be ready. The days that followed were marked by a strange, heavy calm. The snow had finally stopped, but the air over Ashland still carried that sharp metallic chill that lingered after a storm. People went about their lives as usual. Shops reopened, the roads cleared, and the office where Daniel Harlow ruled over his staff returned to its brisk rhythm. But beneath the routine, something had shifted. The whispers hadn't gone away. The employees had seen too much, and though no one dared say it aloud, Daniel's grip on the company was loosening. He noticed it in the small things, the hesitant tone of greetings, the way people avoided his gaze in the hallway, the soft murmur that cut off when he entered a room. Power, he realized, was quieter when people feared you, but it was louder when they stopped. Across town, Clara Benson was rebuilding her rhythm. She had taken a temporary position at the local clinic, filing patient records and managing appointments. It wasn't glamorous, but it was peaceful, and the people there treated her with kindness rather than tension. Some mornings she even brought coffee for the nurses, a small gesture that helped her feel like she belonged again. The world was beginning to thaw, and though her trust in people still wavered, she found herself thinking less about what had happened and more about what could be next. Still, there were moments, quiet ones, when the shadow of Daniel's voice returned to her thoughts, uninvited and cold. Evan Pierce, the Navy SEAL, kept a quiet watch from the edges of town. He didn't interfere or make himself known unless he needed to. That was his way. Observe first, act only when there was no other choice. He spent his days training with Ranger, hiking through the hills, or helping the sheriff with odd tasks around the station. He had learned, through the rhythm of discipline, how to live in silence without letting it consume him. But lately, even he could sense something stirring beneath the quiet. Ranger felt it too. The dog would often stand by the window at dusk, staring toward town, with that fixed, thoughtful stillness that always meant instinct had caught something the eye hadn't. Daniel sat alone in his corner office late one evening, the sound of his watch ticking filling the silence. He had tried to bury himself in work, but nothing erased the sting of his humiliation. In every email, every board meeting, he felt the unspoken judgment from those who had witnessed the confrontation. He told himself it was temporary, that people would forget. They always did. But each time he looked in the mirror, he saw less of the man he wanted to be and more of the one he could not escape, the man who had lost control. His reflection didn't frighten him, but it challenged him, and that made him angry. It wasn't enough to rebuild his reputation. He needed to prove that no one could challenge his authority and walk away untouched. That evening, as the office lights dimmed and the last employees left, Daniel made a call. His tone was low, deliberate. "You still have those contacts in Portland?" he asked. A pause, then a short reply from the other end. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Good. I need something handled quietly." The next morning dawned pale and cold. sunlight struggling to break through a film of gray clouds. Clara arrived at the clinic early, as she always did, her breath visible in the chill air. The routine helped. The smell of disinfectant, the hum of printers, the rhythm of polite greetings, they grounded her. But as the morning went on, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. When she stepped out back to take a short break, she noticed a dark SUV parked across the street. Its windows were tinted, its engine running. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, someone waiting for a ride perhaps. But something about the way it stayed put, even after 15 minutes, made her uneasy. When she went back inside, she sent a quick message to Sheriff Dwyer's office just in case. At the sheriff's station, Dwyer read the message and frowned. Evan was standing nearby sorting through some reports. "She just said an SUV," Dwyer muttered. "Didn't mention plates." Evan's attention snapped up. "Where?" "Outside the clinic," Dwyer said. Evan didn't wait for more. He grabbed his jacket, gave a short whistle, and Ranger was on his feet instantly. The sheriff sighed. "Pierce, just try not to make a scene." Evan gave a faint half-smile. "I never do." By the time he arrived, the SUV was gone. The only sign of movement was the soft swirl of snow where the tires had been. Clara was standing by the window inside, her face tense but calm, when she saw him. "It left a few minutes ago," she said. "I might have overreacted." Evan shook his head. "You didn't. Better cautious than sorry." She exhaled slowly, grateful for his steadiness. "I didn't think he'd actually come back." "He hasn't yet," Evan said, "but he's testing boundaries, seeing what you'll do." "Then what do I do?" she asked quietly. "You live your life," he said. "You don't let him take that from you." Ranger nudged her hand with his nose, his tail giving a slow, reassuring wag. She smiled faintly. "He remembers me." "He doesn't forget good people," Evan said. The day passed without further incident, but the silence felt heavier now. Daniel S.'s presence hung over the town like a rumor no one wanted to believe, but everyone knew was true. That night, a light snowfall began again, blanketing the roads in quiet white. Evan drove past the clinic one last time before heading home, scanning the area. Ranger's eyes tracked every shadow. Everything looked still, but both of them felt it. The calm before something moved again. Inside his cabin, Evan set his gear down by the door and poured himself a drink. Ranger settled by the fire, though his gaze kept drifting toward the window. "You feel it too, huh?" Evan said softly. The dog gave a small, restless sound. "Yeah," Evan murmured. "He's not finished." He turned off the light and stood in the dark for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. Outside, the woods were still, blanketed in white. But deep down, he knew men like Daniel didn't know how to let go. They only paused long enough to find another way to strike. Meanwhile, Daniel stood on his balcony overlooking the town, the faint lights of Ashland glowing below like stars in the fog. He had made a plan. It wasn't as crude as confrontation this time. It was cleaner, quieter. There were ways to destroy people that didn't involve shouting. Reputation, trust, opportunity, those were the currencies of power, and he still had plenty of those left. He smiled thinly, watching the faint flicker of movement from a distant farmhouse light. "You wanted to play fair," he said under his breath. "Let's see how fair feels when the ground moves under you." Morning light crept through the blinds of Evan Pierce's cabin, muted and cold. He woke early, as he always did, his movements deliberate and quiet. Ranger was already pacing by the door, ears alert. The German shepherd had that look again, the one that told Evan something was off. He pulled on his coat and stepped outside, the air biting at his face, the frost crunching under his boots. Tire tracks cut across the snow leading down toward the main road, fresh ones. Someone had been out here not long ago. Evan crouched, brushing his gloved hand over the marks, then looked down at Ranger. "We'll keep our eyes open," he said calmly. The dog gave a low, thoughtful huff. Neither of them believed the peace would last. Across town, Clara Benson, the 20-year-old brunette secretary, walked into Harlow Dynamics, a mid-sized firm tucked into the edge of downtown Ashland, Oregon. The office was quiet that morning, too quiet. She could feel it the moment she stepped through the glass doors. Conversations hushed when she passed, and two co-workers at the coffee station quickly turned away, pretending to read something on their phones. Her desk sat outside the CEO EES office, a polished oak door with a silver nameplate that read, Daniel Harlow, Chief Executive Officer. Clara set down her bag and tried to ignore the tension pressing in around her. But within minutes, she found out why. A co-worker she trusted, Jenna, leaned over her cubicle and whispered, "Someone's been spreading rumors, said you messed up a major account." Clara frowned. "What? That's not true." Jenna hesitated. "I know, but people are saying Mr. Harlow's furious." By late morning, Clara was called into Daniel Harlow's office. Harlow, the 45-year-old CEO with sharp eyes and a too-perfect suit, sat behind his mahogany desk, fingers steepled. "Sit down," he said, not looking up from his computer. She did, hands folded in her lap. "Do you know why we lost the Westport proposal?" he asked. "Sir, because someone didn't send the final document," he interrupted, "and your name was on the file." "That's impossible," Clara said quietly. "I sent it myself." He leaned back, eyes cold. "Are you calling me a liar?" She swallowed hard. "No, sir. I'm saying maybe there was a system error." He stood, the movement sudden enough to make her flinch. "Do you think this company runs on excuses?" The silence that followed was heavy. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a sharp whisper. "You're lucky I don't fire you right here." Clara kept her gaze down. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harlow." "You'll be sorry if this happens again," he said. Then, as if to punctuate the conversation, he brushed past her roughly on his way out, leaving her frozen in her chair. By noon, Evan Pierce, the 38-year-old Navy SEAL, stood across from Sheriff Dwyer, a weathered man with gray hair and a calm voice. "He's moving differently now," Evan said. "Less public, more calculated." The sheriff rubbed his temples. "You're talking about Harlow again?" "He's targeting her," Evan said. "He's smart. Uses words, connections, whispers. It's harder to prove." The sheriff sighed. "You can't police office gossip, Evan." "No," Evan said, eyes narrowing. "But I can recognize when someone's trying to destroy another person's life. He's isolating her. That's how it starts." The sheriff gave him a long look. "You've seen this before, haven't you?" "Too many times," Evan said quietly. That evening, Clara sat in her small apartment, staring at her laptop screen. The hum of the heater was the only sound. She was typing an email to the company board, hoping to clear her name, but every sentence sounded defensive. Every word felt like a plea. She pressed delete. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. "Miss Benson," a man's voice said, smooth and professional. "This is Mark Hollis from Northwest Investments. I'm calling about the position you applied for." I haven't applied anywhere," she said. "Really?" he replied. "Your resume lists you as unemployed after a termination from Harlow Dynamics." Her pulse quickened. "That's not true," she said firmly. "I still work there." "Well, ma'am, I'm sorry for the confusion. We'll remove your application." The call ended. She sat frozen, realization dawning like ice spreading across glass. Harlow was making sure no one would hire her. He wasn't just humiliating her at work. He was trying to erase her outside it. Later that night, Evan walked through the quiet streets of town, Ranger trotting at his side. The cold air felt sharper than usual, like the world itself was on edge. He stopped in front of the office building across from the diner. Only one window glowed on the top floor, Harlow's. Evan stared at it for a long moment, thinking of Clara, Wes' tired eyes, and how easily fear spreads when no one stands up to it. Some fights weren't about weapons or muscle. They were about courage, about knowing when to step in. At the same time, Clara heard a soft sound at her apartment door. She froze. Then she saw it. A folded note slid under the crack. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. "We need to talk. You're ruining both of our lives. Meet me at the office tomorrow after hours. Alone." She stared at the message, dread tightening in her chest. Every instinct screamed not to go, but another voice, one that wanted this nightmare to end, kept her frozen in indecision. Finally, she picked up her phone and sent a message to Evan. "I think he wants to meet." Evan was at her apartment within 20 minutes. The air was colder now, snow falling in thin sheets against the windows. Ranger followed him in, shaking off the frost. Clara handed him the note. He read it once, jaw tightening. "You're not going," he said. "If I don't," she whispered, "he might come here instead." Evan shook his head. "Then I'll be there. You're not facing him alone." "You think he'll try something?" "He's losing control," Evan said. Men like that, once their power's questioned, they get dangerous. Ranger let out a low growl, sensing the tension. Evan placed a hand on the dog's back. "We'll be ready." The next day crept by in uneasy silence. Clara went through the motions at work, ignoring the whispers and sidelong glances. By evening, most of the staff had gone home, leaving the office floor bathed in dim, bluish light. Her desk lamp flickered once, then steadied. Outside, snow began to fall again, muting the city sounds. Across town, Evan was gearing up in his truck, the headlights cutting through the fog. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, eyes fixed ahead. "Let's go, buddy," Evan said quietly. They drove toward downtown, the lights of Ashland fading behind them like embers dying in the cold. Inside Harlow Dynamics, the air was still and cold, humming faintly with the sound of heating vents. The lights from the hallway cast long, pale reflections across the polished floor. Clara Benson stood near the reception desk, her coat still on, one hand clutched tightly around her phone. She told herself she was only there to make him stop, to tell him in person that this was over, but even she didn't to fully believe it. The silence pressed in, broken only by the faint click of footsteps from the corridor. Daniel Harlow appeared, dressed sharply as always, his black coat draped over his arm. He smiled as if greeting an old friend. "You came," he said. Clara stayed where she was. "I didn't come for you," she said quietly. "I came to tell you to leave me alone." He walked closer, his voice calm but condescending. "You're being dramatic. No one's trying to hurt you. I just wanted to talk like adults." "You've done enough talking," she replied, her tone steady. "This is harassment, Daniel." He chuckled under his breath, setting his coat on a chair. "You think anyone's going to believe that? You worked for me. I gave you every opportunity. Now you're trying to ruin me because your pride got bruised." Clara took a step back, shaking her head. "You ruined yourself," she said. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." That last line landed harder than she expected. For a moment, Daniel's expression flickered, something sharp and ugly beneath the charm. "You should be," he said softly. The sound of his words hung in the air just long enough for another sound to break it, the soft click of a door opening behind them. Daniel turned sharply. Evan Pierce, the Caucasian Navy SEAL, stepped inside, his tall frame blocking the exit, Ranger standing close by, eyes locked on Daniel. "Evening," Evan said evenly. "The building's closed." "You shouldn't be here." Daniel straightened, his voice cold. "This is my company. I can be wherever I want." "Not tonight," Evan replied. His tone was calm, but there was a weight behind it that filled the room. Clara exhaled, relief mixing with fear. Daniel's composure faltered briefly before returning with a smirk. "So this is your bodyguard now? How romantic." "She doesn't need a bodyguard," Evan said. "Just someone who doesn't walk away." Daniel took a slow step forward, folding his arms. "You think this is going to end well for you? You have no idea who I am." "I know exactly who you are," Evan said, "and I've met your kind before." "My kind," Daniel sneered. "You don't know anything about power." Evan's gaze didn't waver. "Power's not what you do when people are watching. It's what you do when they're not." Daniel scoffed, but the faint tremor in his jaw betrayed his irritation. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he said. I'm the one who built everything here. People depend on me. Evan's reply came like steady thunder. Then start acting like someone worth depending on. For a long moment, no one moved. The hum of the lights filled the space between them. Then Daniel stepped closer to Clara, lowering his voice. You think this soldier's going to save you? He'll be gone tomorrow, and you'll still be nothing. That was when Ranger growled, low, deliberate, a warning that stopped Daniel in his tracks. Evan didn't move, but his tone shifted, still calm, but sharper now. You're done talking. Daniel turned to him, his control slipping. You think you can tell me what to do in my own office? I'm not telling you, Evan said. I'm giving you a choice. Leave now or this gets worse for you. Daniel laughed, but it didn't sound like amusement. You think I'm scared of you? No, Evan said. I think you're scared of losing control. That's why you're here. That struck something in Daniel. His confidence faltered, replaced by something raw and defensive. You don't understand what it's like to build everything from nothing, he snapped. You don't understand what it costs to stay on top? You're right, Evan said quietly. I only understand what it costs when you stop caring who you hurt to get there. The tension broke like a drawn bowstring. Daniel stepped forward fast, reaching for Clara's arm, but Evan was already moving. He caught Daniel's wrist mid-motion, holding it firmly without aggression. His voice stayed level. That's enough. Daniel tried to pull away, but Evan's grip didn't tighten. It simply didn't yield. You need to go home, Evan said. This isn't a fight you can win. Daniel froze, breathing hard, his arrogance starting to crumble into something like disbelief. For a moment, he seemed to realize the futility of it all, that there was no fear left in the people he once controlled. Slowly, Evan released his wrist and stepped back. Ranger stayed poised beside him, ready but calm. You think this ends with you standing in my office? Daniel said finally, his tone brittle. No, Evan replied. It ends with you walking out that door. Daniel hesitated, his gaze shifting between them. For the first time he looked smaller, the weight of his self-importance collapsing under the quiet truth of his defeat. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit. The echo of his footsteps faded into the hall until the sound was gone. The air that followed was still, as if the building itself exhaled in relief. Clara sank into one of the chairs, her hands trembling slightly. It's over, she whispered. Evan looked toward the door for a long moment before replying. Maybe, he said, but people like him don't stop until the world tells them they have to. Ranger moved closer, resting his head on Clara's knee, grounding her in the present. She smiled faintly and stroked the dog's fur. Thank you, she said softly. Both of you. Evan gave a small nod. Get some rest. I'll walk you home. She hesitated. You don't have to keep watching out for me. That's what we do, he said simply. As they stepped outside into the cold, the snow had begun to fall again, light this time, like a reset on the world. The streetlights glowed dimly through the flurries, and the night was quiet except for their footsteps. Behind them, Harlow Dynamics stood dark and empty, its glass reflecting nothing but the falling snow. Somewhere inside, Daniel Harlow's reflection no longer looked back at him with pride, only with the faint recognition that his power, like the snow beneath their feet, had begun to melt away. The following days unfolded in quiet ripples that spread across the town of Ashland and Oregon. Word traveled fast about what had happened inside Harlow Dynamics, though the details remained a mystery. All anyone knew was that something inside the company had shifted overnight. Daniel Harlow stopped showing up to the office. The man whose voice once echoed through every floor had become a ghost in his own empire. Rumors circled of emergency board meetings, of shareholders whispering about a sudden leadership change. In coffee shops and grocery lines, people spoke his name in hushed tones as though saying it too loudly might bring back the unease he had left behind. The world, it seemed, had a way of moving on from tyrants, slowly at first, then all at once. For Clara Benson, the change felt like breathing freely after weeks underwater. The office, once filled with tension, felt lighter. Her co-workers, those who had once avoided her, now greeted her with quiet warmth, perhaps even guilt. The rumors that once dragged her down had disappeared, replaced with small gestures of respect. Someone refilling her coffee mug, another offering to help with reports. She stayed late by choice, determined to rebuild the pieces Harlow had tried to scatter. It wasn't about proving him wrong anymore. It was about reclaiming her peace. Still, every now and then, as she typed beneath the glow of her desk lamp, she caught herself glancing toward the frosted windows, half expecting to see headlights idling across the street. Sometimes she thought she did, and in those moments a faint sense of calm washed over her. Maybe it was Evan Hias' truck, parked just far enough away to give her space, but close enough to remind her she wasn't T.E. alone. Evan Pierce, the 38-year-old Caucasian Navy SEAL, had returned to his quiet rhythm. His cabin on the edge of town was simple but steady, the kind of place where time moved slower. Each morning he walked the perimeter with Ranger, his German shepherd, the two of them scanning the tree line as if habit refused to fade. He fixed the porch roof, stacked new firewood, and kept his radio tuned to the sheriff's channel. Life had settled again, but something in him had changed. He'd come to Ashland to find solitude, to rebuild after years of chaos, but now the town had become something more, a reminder that not all battles needed to be fought with fists. Some were won by staying, by standing guard, by choosing to protect rather than to run. Meanwhile, Daniel Harlow sat alone in his mansion on the hill overlooking Ashland. The view that once made him feel powerful now mocked him. The board had voted him out quietly. No press, no scandal, just absence. The world had stopped listening to him. He still wore his tailored suits, still poured his expensive whiskey, but the illusion had cracked. The phone no longer rang. Emails went unanswered. His empire ran without him. And for the first time, he had to live with what he'd built, a company that survived him, employees who thrived without him, and a silence so deep it echoed. He'd spent years mistaking control for respect, fear for loyalty. Now he understood the truth. Power that depends on obedience dies the moment people stop fearing you. One cold afternoon, Clara stepped out of the building after work and stopped short. Daniel stood across the street near a cafe, hands in his coat pockets, staring at nothing in particular. The wind caught his hair, and for the first time he looked smaller, less a ruler, more a man stripped of purpose. Their eyes met. She could have turned away, but she didn't. She crossed the street slowly, steady but calm. His voice, when it came, was quieter than she remembered. "I didn't expect you to stop," he said. She held his gaze. "I didn't expect to see you here." He gave a small, humorless smile. "Guess that makes two of us." There was no venom left, only exhaustion. "I lost everything," he said finally. "No," she replied evenly. "You lost control. There's a difference." He blinked, the words hitting harder than he expected. "I thought that was the same thing," he said softly. She shook her head. "It never was." Then she turned and walked away. He didn't follow. That night, Evan stopped by the sheriff's station to drop off a final report from the incident. Sheriff Dwyer, the grizzled man with calm eyes, looked up from his desk. "You're still in town," he said with a smirk. Evan shrugged lightly. "For now?" Dwyer leaned back in his chair. "Place feels safer with you and that dog around. You might have done more for Ashland than the last few city councils combined." Evan smiled faintly. "We just showed up at the right time." "That wasn't luck," Dwyer said. "That was conviction. People noticed the difference." The words stayed with him long after he left. Outside, Ranger trotted beside Evan as they walked down Main Street. The town was calm now, glowing under strings of winter lights. Snow drifted softly across the sidewalks, catching the reflections of storefronts. Ashland finally felt steady again, like it had exhaled after months of holding its breath. A week later, Clara found a small package waiting on her desk. Inside was a simple bouquet of white lilies tied with a silver ribbon. No note, no name, only a small tag with 4 handwritten words, for peace and beginnings. She smiled, placing them beside her computer where the morning sun could reach. She didn't need to ask who had sent them. That evening, Evan stood on his porch overlooking the valley. The cold rolled through the pines, but it didn't bite the way it used to. Ranger lay beside him, resting but alert, eyes following the flicker of town lights below. "You did good, boy," Evan said quietly. The dog's tail thumped once against the porch. Down in the valley, the glow of Ashland shimmered against the snow, warm and steady. He thought of Clara, of how she had stood her ground with quiet dignity. That, he knew, was the kind of courage that truly changed things. Somewhere on the hill above, Daniel Harlow stood before his own window, looking out at the same town. But where Evan saw peace, Daniel saw distance. The world had gone on without him, and for the first time, he understood the cost of everything he'd built. Maybe someday he'd learn something from it, maybe not. The story had already moved past him. If this story of courage and quiet justice touched your heart, please share it so others can remember that true strength doesn't need to shout. It stands calm, patient, and unshakable in the face of cruelty. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that honor resilience, compassion, and